with Burley.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for inviting me to participate in this conference, and to everyone for coming along. It's a great privilege to be kicking off this second day. I've written a paper, and I'll come to that in a moment, but before I start on it, I was going to perhaps respond to a point that Miller raised yesterday, and she's not here at the moment, is she? But this issue of why Samkhya is referred to as dualist. This is an interesting question, and the way I would address that question would be to consider what I regard as the starting point of the Samkhya system, the Samkhya philosophy, which is an analysis of the sort of underlying necessary constitutive conditions of any possible experience to arise. And I think that one of the insights, one of the fascinating aspects of the Samkhya philosophy is the way in which it refuses, at least in its classical form, it refuses to go beyond a duad of Purusha and Prakriti as the necessary conditions of experience to arise. So it refuses to reduce those two to any sort of supreme, absolute principle that we might call Brahman. And I think the reason why the Samkhya system refuses to take that extra step is because it sees the necessary conditions for any experience to arise as being two. The source of objectivity on the one hand and the source of subjectivity on the other. And I think the Samkhya philosophers regarded those as irreducible principles if you're going to have any kind of experience. If you reduce them to one, there's no possibility of experience arising, and I think there's a sort of this is why I draw on Kantian thought in the book that I wrote on the topic, because I think there's something analogous to a transcendental argument going on, which is that given that we have experience, that's a fact. The question then is, what has to be in place for that experience to occur? And if you say, oh, well, everything is Brahman, you don't get the experience started. You have to have some projection out of Brahman, and then you've got two. So I think what Samkhya does is to make the claim, maybe not explicitly, but I think it's implicit, that in order for there to be experience, there has to be at least those two. The source of subjectivity, the source of objectivity. Now, I would admit, and this came up yesterday, I would admit that the Purusha Bahutva, the multiplicity of Purushas doctrine, as we could call it, in Samkhya 18, is a problematic feature for this picture. I think one of the reasons it's problematic is because it's not carried through systematically, rigorously throughout the Samkhya text. We get it in Samkhya 18, and I think then it pretty much drops out of the story. We don't really get it referred to within the text itself. Rather, what we find is, or are, many karikas in which it's just implied that there's Purusha Prakriti, maybe there's manifest Prakriti and unmanifest Prakriti, but this multiplicity of Purushas seems to be very much sidelined, marginalised. I think what's going on there is that in Samkhya 18 we have the recognition that we have a sort of attempted response to the question, when one Purusha realises Kaivalya, how is it the case that still loads of ignorant people around? And the response to that, the philosophical response to that is, well, that's because there's a multiplicity of Purushas. And we find that also, if I remember rightly, in Yoga Sutra 2.22, or at least in Vyasa's commentary, a distinction being made between the skillful, the kushala, or the what we say, the liberated Purusha on one hand, and the unliberated Purusha on the other. So there's at least again an implicit acknowledgement of the multiplicity of Purushas in the Yoga Sutra, but you don't find that very much elaborated. And the reason in discussion yesterday I said very pithily, very concisely, that I think there's a tension in the text is largely because, as I say, it's not really followed through within the Samkhya as a whole. So when we have these analogies that are intended to somehow give us an insight, give us some explication of the relationship between Purusha and Prakriti, such as the sighted but immobile person being carried by the blind but mobile person. Well, there's no suggestion of a multiplicity there. It's not a multiplicity of sighted people being carried on the shoulders of a blind walking person. So that's what I mean by the multiplicity having dropped out of the picture. And similarly with the dancer and or the performer and the spectator analogy, it says that when Prakriti has sort of realised that she's being observed, that she's been seen, she desists from dancing, or she desists from performing. Purusha recognises that he is the seer. What about all the other Purushas? You know, I think we're not given an image like a sort of cinema where you've got the performance going on, or a stage with multiple Purushas. We're just giving this sort of binary image. So there's a lot more that could have been done with that analogy within the text, but it isn't done. You know, I mean, if the notion of a multiplicity of Purushas was being followed through systematically, rigorously, and consistently. So that's to explain what I meant by I think there is a tension in the text. I think there's an indecision about how the extent to which to emphasise this multiplicity idea. I'm eating into the time for the paper that I've prepared here, but just on that same theme, that same point, there's a sense in which the multiplicity of Purushas doctrine is an acknowledgement of a third-person perspective on Purusha, whereas the conception of Purusha as singular we could regard as a sort of first-person perspective on Purusha. So from my perspective, qua individual human being, there is Purusha is my true self, my true nature. Whereas if I'm thinking about, in a more global way, about other people in the world, then I have to recognize that there are multiple Purushas. So I think there's something like, I mean that's a very quick way of putting it, but I think it's something like a third-person, first-person distinction in play there. Now I ought to come to the paper that I've prepared. This paper began its life as a presentation at a workshop at the University of Oxford last June. And the workshop was on the theme of substance and essence in Indian philosophy. And so I was presenting something on these concepts of substance and essence in Samkhya philosophy. And I found that by approaching Samkhya philosophy through these Western terms, substance and essence, it did provide quite a useful lens, at least onto the various interpretations that have been put forward about various aspects of Samkhya philosophy. Because when we start looking, we will find that the terms substance and essence have been applied to multiple different sort of concepts within Samkhya philosophy. So by trying to think through how appropriate or inappropriate those applications are, we, I think, find a useful resource, a useful way of reflecting upon aspects of the Samkhya philosophy. Now, I'm not really going to reflect on it very much here because there's not a lot of time. What I want to do is say something about, just give a few examples, a few representative examples of how the terms substance and essence have been applied to Samkhya philosophy. Then, in the second half of the paper, I'm going to be looking at the concept of tattva more closely, and tattva abhyasa as it occurs in Samkhya 64, and trying to say a little bit about that in relation. That's in explanation of the latter part of the title of my paper, the soteriological practice. You know, what is it? What is the soteriological practice? The liberative practice of Samkhya philosophy. And there's a connection between the two halves of the paper because tattva is among the terms that have been translated or rendered into English as essence. quite commonly. Okay, so I'm going to condense. I've got a full version of the paper, and I'm going to cut bits of that because there wouldn't be time. So I did have a section where I sort of introduce Sankhya philosophy. I say why I think it's important to study and know stuff about not only Indian philosophy in general, but Indian culture, Indian religion, Indian mythology, and so on. Because I think Sankhyan themes come through very vividly in one sense, but in another sense, sort of veiled and disguised within broader aspects of Indic culture. But I'm going to have to skip that bit, and I'll start reading what I've got here. So the first section is substance and essence in interpretations of Sankhya. The terms substance and essence have been utilised by interpreters of Sankhya in various ways. My examples here have been chosen in part to illustrate that diversity. For a start, it is not uncommon to find property characterised as a substance. In a pioneering study first published in 1881, John Davis, influenced by Schopenhauer's conception of a primordial will, which, I think you alluded to Schopenhauer yesterday, didn't you? Underlying all phenomena, describes property as, quote, a blind unconscious force, or rather a primal substance. The metaphor of blindness is in keeping with the image deployed in the Sankhya of a blind person carrying someone who is sighted but unable to walk. The blind person represents property, active but non-conscious, and the sighted person represents Purusha, defined in terms of consciousness, awareness, and inactivity. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, and we also got some mentions yesterday, describes property as the fundamental substance out of which the world evolves, but notes that it is not a material substance. The property generates not only the material universe, but also mental phenomena. This contrasts with the many interpreters who readily translate property as matter, material substance, or, as Gerald Larson puts it in one place, sheer materiality. What enables these latter translations is the ambiguity of terms such as matter and material. On one hand, they can have the broad sense of merely what something is made of, regardless of whether it is physical, mental, or anything else. On the other hand, the terms matter and material can have the narrower sense of standing in opposition to anything non-physical. In this sense, materiality is to be contrasted with mental or psychological phenomena. No, sorry, I didn't share that. Roughly the same ambiguity obtains in the case of the term substance. Sometimes it's understood in a broad sense, with material substance and mental substance being varieties of the more general category. But at other times, substance denotes that which stands opposed to the mental, psychological, or spiritual. Provided it's the broader sense that's intended, then there's normally little harm in translating property as matter, material substance, or merely as substance, but confusion arises when interpreters equivocate between different senses of these terms. The need to be clear about how the term substance is being used can be illustrated by means of two passages from Gerald Larson. In one place, he remarks that, quote, the Samkhya, the apparent subject, namely internal awareness in terms of buddhi, ahankara, manas, and so forth, is really substance, mula prakriti, as triguna. Here, in line with most interpreters, Larson is taking Sankhya to be denying that buddhi and the other psychological faculties are constitutive of conscious subjectivity. These faculties are really substance inasmuch as they are products of prakriti, whereas consciousness is identified with purusha. Elsewhere, however, Larson asserts that, quote, Sankhya refuses to accept a real distinction between categories like substance, quality, motion, universals, and so forth, even within the context of prakriti. Accepting this contention would cause problems for the use of substance, the term substance, to characterize prakriti. But since Larson doesn't elaborate the point, it isn't immediately clear in what sense of substance he considers it to be the case that Sankhya refuses to distinguish this from the other categories mentioned. Other Samkhya principles that have been referred to as substances include Prakrity's three constituents, namely the gunas. The source of this tendency is the commentary on Samkhya Sutra, not Samkhya, by the 15th or 16th century philosopher Vijnana Bhikshu, who defines the gunas as dravyas. Dravya being a term for which substance is the most common English translation. This way of defining the gunas has subsequently been adopted by a small number of more recent commentators, even though the range of associations that each of the gunas has leaves it less than clear what sense it makes to regard them as substances. We get a hint of this range in a passage from Kishore Chakrabarty's book on Indian philosophy of mind, in which he notes that, quote, Prakriti contains three kinds of substance, called sattva, literally being, essence, vitality, inherent power, courage, etc. Rajas, literally dust, any small particle, menstrual discharge, passion, etc. We get a sort of taste of the range of associations that the gunas can have here. And tamas, literally darkness, error, grief, etc. We might say etc., etc., etc. And there's so many different associations. These are called gunas. If, as I'm suggesting, we view, or as I do suggest, we view the term for each of the gunas as standing for something more like a network of correspondences and associations than like a single entity, then defining the gunas as substances merely adds to the collection of associations rather than being definitive of the concept, and I'm not sure that it adds a great deal. Irrespective of whether we call them substances, the gunas are generally understood to be the three irreducible constituents of Prakriti. It is, according to Samkhya, their relative configuration or preponderance that constitutes Prakriti's manifestation or expression or actualization. For this reason, many interpreters stress the dynamic, active or processual character of Prakriti's constitution, with Larson, for example, designating the gunas collectively as the tripartite constituent process, and referring to Samkhya more generally as a form of process materialism. As I implied earlier, the term materialism is prone to be misleading here unless material is understood, the term material is understood broadly. But the emphasis on Prakriti's manifestation as process is fitting. This manifestation is, we might say, the ongoing process of experiential life. I think experiential life is quite combining those two terms, experience and life. Before turning to the term essence, it should be noted that substance has also occasionally been applied to Purusha, in the form of the term spiritual substance, which is more commonly used in connection with the substance dualism of René Descartes and that sort of area. In brief, Descartes conceives of a spiritual substance, or mind, as being constituted by thinking, or cogitantis, and of corporeal substance, or matter, as being constituted by extension. Both thinking and extension comprise several modes, with those of thinking substances including, quote from Descartes, all the modes both of perceiving and of willing. Descartes also locates sensations, emotions and appetites in the mind. Thus, it's clear that what Descartes regards as a mind or spiritual substance is much closer to what Samkhya, at least in most instances, regards as Prakriti, or aspects of Prakriti, than to Samkhya's conception of Purusha. This is why Larson describes Samkhya's ontology as an eccentric form of dualism. The term eccentric being meant to indicate simply that Samkhya dualism does not fit the usual or conventional notions of dualism. That was a quotation from Larson, and now by that I suppose he means the usual conventional notions of dualism as they occur in Western philosophy in particular. Again, I'd say that there's no necessary harm in using a term such as spiritual substance to designate Purusha, provided it isn't assumed that merely by applying it one is somehow given an account of what the term Purusha means. And there are, of course, dangers of giving a misleading account if one uses that term. But provided one spells out what one means in the right way, then, well, you know, you can use any term as a placeholder, but it's the explanation that's important. Turning now to the term essence, we've seen one occurrence of this already in the quotation from Kishore Chakrabarti. There it was one of the several terms used to characterize the sattva guna, which might also be rendered as beingness or simply simply existence. The identification of sattva with essence has a long pedigree. The early 19th century philologist Christian Larsen, for instance, used the Latin terms essentia, impetus, and caligo to denote sattva, rajas, and tamas respectively, and a number of subsequent scholars have continued to use essence in this or comparable ways. Now, due to time, I'm wondering whether to, because I took up a bit of my time at the beginning with other stuff, I'm wondering whether to skip some of this on essence, because I don't think it contributes a lot to what I want to say about tattva, so I'm going to move to that section, the concept of tattva. So tattva is widely held to be the term that designates either any of the 25 principles that make up Samkhya's ontology, or alternatively any of these principles except the two co-fundamental ones, namely purusha and prakriti. In support of the decision to translate tattva as essence, Rodney Parrott cites the 6th century commentator Gaudapada, who we've met yesterday as well, who, as Parrott remarks, glosses tattva as astitvam, literally isness, which Parrott considers to be semantically close to the term essence. Essence, however, is far from being the only or even the most common translation of tattva. Nor is the meaning of tattva universally agreed upon by commentators, whether traditional or modern, since the products or evolutes of prakriti that many interpreters refer to as tattvas are, along with prakriti and purusha, central to Samkhya philosophy. It will be useful in the remainder of this paper to take a closer look at how the notion of tattva has been understood. Despite the prevalence of the term tattva in commentarial and interpretive literature, it occurs only once in the Samkhya Karika itself. The 64th Karika reads, quote, thus from tattva, and it doesn't even occur on its own, it occurs in the sort of combined phrase tattva abhyasa. So it says, thus from tattva abhyasa, the knowledge arises that I'm not mine, not I. Being free of delusion, this knowledge is complete, pure, and singular. The compound term tattva abhyasa is generally agreed to mean the practice or practicing of tattva. But there's disagreement between traditional commentators over what tattva itself denotes. Hence, while Gaudapada is among those who construe tattva abhyasa to mean practicing the meditation of 25 principles, or in Horace Wilson's older translation, the study of the 25 principles, the later 9th or 10th century commentator Vachaspati Mishra understands it to mean something more like simply the practice of reality or the practice of truth. As translated by Ganganatha Jha, at least, with that qualification, Vachaspati remarks that the word truth or tattva indicate, there might be a question being begged in that translation, but the word truth or tattva indicates the knowledge thereof. By means of practice of truth, through a long course of repeated, uninterrupted and respectful exercise of true knowledge, wisdom manifesting the distinction of spirit from matter is attained.
It's heavily informed by Patanjali also.
The use of tattva as truth?
No, the repeated, uninterrupted, and respectful exercise of truth.
That explication of abhyasa, yeah, that's right. Not unjustifiably, I think, as I'll come to. The phrase that Jha here translates as distinction of spirit from matter, in fact reads sattva purushanyata, which is more accurately rendered as difference between sattva and purusha, with sattva in this context probably being synonym of buddhi. The practical difference between Gaudapada's and Vachaspati's respective interpretations is, however, meagre, I think, when it comes down to it, for it's implicit within the idea of studying or meditating upon the categories of prakriti that one is doing so for the purpose of distinguishing them from purusha. It's by that means that there arises the knowledge of purusha's fundamental non-identity with anything constitutive of psychologically complex self. Of course, if purusha is understood to consist in pure non-intentional consciousness devoid of content, then the very idea of knowledge arising in Purusha is problematic, prompting some interpreters to insist that it cannot strictly be in Purusha that the knowledge arises. It must instead be in Buddhi, the intellectual or intentional faculty. Larson, for example, interprets Karaka 64 to be a pronouncement of Buddhi's knowledge that I am not conscious, consciousness does not belong to me, the I is not conscious. But such a reading, replete with parenthetical interpolations, places strain on the text, especially when considered in the light of the immediately succeeding two verses, which read, in part, then Purusha, remaining fixed in himself like a spectator, sees Prakriti, who has returned to inactivity. I have seen her, says the spectating one. I have been seen, says the other, desisting. Although the two are in conjunction, some yoga, there is no initiation of further emergence. And I think, if I remember, Anna quoted the same passage as well. There remains, however, an unresolved tension in the Samkhya Karaka and within Samkhya philosophy as a whole, I think, concerning the question of Purusha's activity. On the one hand, as David Burke remarks, quote, the Karakas are quite clear on the point that Purusha is passive consciousness unable to pursue anything actively. Activity, including transformation, parinama, and transmigration, samsara, is all on the side of Prakriti, end quote. This passivity is emphasized in, among other places, Karaka 19, which affirms that, owing to its being the opposite of Prakriti, Purusha can be characterized in terms of witnessing, aloneness, equanimity, awareness, and inactivity. On the other hand, inactivity. On the other hand, the soteriological dynamic of Samkhya philosophy demands that some change must occur in or to Purusha, a movement from entrapment and immersion in Prakriti's display to release and awakening to Purusha's own independence. Thus we find statements such as those in Karaka 66, in which it is unambiguously Purusha, qua spectator or prekshaka, who declares that he has seen Prakriti, thereby confirming, in case there were any doubt, that in Karaka 64 it is similarly Purusha who's come to recognize and to relinquish his previously beguiled condition. Ultimately, now I should check time here because we started, well, I started probably 5 minutes later than
You're fine.
Yeah, so, I mean, can my whole slot go until about 10:05?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'll stick with what I've got here then. Yeah. Well, I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so I'm going to move to. Yeah, I'll move to section 3, from ontology to praxis, and if anything doesn't make sense or I've missed something out, then I'll come back to it. So, as we've seen, however we understand the term tattva as it occurs in Karaka 64, it's inextricably linked with the notion of a practice or a process of discovery. This raises the question of what Samkhya practice consists in. It's often assumed that Samkhya promotes a largely or exclusively rationalistic form of practice, but it's rarely made explicit what this is supposed to involve. Anima Sen Gupta, for example, describes Samkhya as, quote, a rationalistic system, on the grounds that it has established the reality of its metaphysical principles by means of yukti or reasoning. In doing so, she closely echoes several earlier scholars, such as Richard Garber, going right back to the late 19th century, who characterizes Samkhya as rationalistic on account of its effort, quote, no, I don't have the quotation on the slide actually, to solve its problems solely by means of reason. This prevalent insistence on Samkhya's rationalistic proclivity is often accompanied by an implicit or explicit contrast between Samkhya and yoga. The contention being that yoga privileges mystical transformation, whereas Samkhya considers liberation as a purely intellectual process. According to this view, while yoga inherits Samkhya's metaphysical schema, it supplements Samkhya's formal rationalistic methodology with a systematic and rigorous meditative praxis, as Roy Perrott puts it. The contrast is, however, misguided, in my view. It exaggerates the divergence and underplays the similarities between Samkhya and Yoga, not to mention ignoring the fact that the Yoga commentarial tradition from the Yoga Bhashya onwards regards Yoga as a form of Samkhya. The construal of Samkhya as favouring rationalistic methods to the exclusion of the kind of sustained meditation outlined in the Yoga Sutra is admittedly encouraged by Karika 4, which, having listed perception, inference, and the receiving of verbal testimony, declares these three to constitute all the means of achieving knowledge. This assertion, combined with the absence of overt instruction on meditation anywhere in the text, has generated the impression that Samkhya eschews yogic meditation. As Rodney Parrott argues, however, what's meant in this context by a means of achieving knowledge, or pramana, is itself only a limited epistemic category. It concerns the type of knowledge that consists in demonstrating, or as Parrott puts it, offering a proof of something. I should just mention, I'm talking about Rodney Parrott here, not Roy Parrott. This must be distinguished from another type of knowledge for which the author of the Samkhya Karika uses the terms jnana, 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 and vijnana, which may be translated as knowledge or discriminative knowledge. Knowledge of this latter type consists in directly discerning a difference, and more specifically directly discerning a difference between Purusha and Prakriti. As Karika 2 affirms, the superior method of attaining the goal of liberation from suffering is that of discriminative knowledge, or vijnana, of the manifest, vyakta, the unmanifest, avyakta, and the knower, vijnana. Or in other words, differentiating between the manifest and unmanifest forms of Prakriti and that which is the ultimate source of knowing or awareness, namely Purusha. Support for this distinction between two types of knowledge is derivable from the traditional commentaries. Especially notable is a passage in the Ukti Deepika, according to which, quote, knowledge is of two kinds, that which is characterized by the understanding of words and so forth, and that which is characterized by understanding the otherness of Purusha and the Gunas. The first of these is said to be of the form of perception, inference, and verbal testimony, whereas the understanding of the difference between Purusha and the Gunas itself comes in two varieties, namely that which is unpreceded, or apurva, and that which is generated through practice, abhyasaja. The Yukti Deepika associates the first of these with reflection, oral instruction, and scriptural study, and describes the second, abhyasaja, as arising, or the knowledge that is consequent upon abhyasaja, as arising upon one's conquering the height of the level of dispassion, and as being characterized by peace, purity, constancy, and contrariety to all produced and unproduced entities. It then equates the latter with precisely the type of knowledge referred to in Karika 64, namely that which consists in the recognition that I am not mine, not I. So, in summary, here's my summary of the second part of the paper. The Yukti Deepika, which has been dubbed by certain scholars the most significant and comprehensive commentary on the Samkhya Karika, first differentiates knowledge arrived at by means of ordinary perception or discursive reasoning from the liberative knowledge that discriminates between Purusha and Prakriti. It then distinguishes different methods of achieving knowledge of the latter sort, and identifies that which includes a sustained process of dispassion or non-attachment, vairagya, with what in Karika 64 is referred to as tattva abhyasa. Hence, we have practice abhyasa paired with non-attachment, vairagya, which is precisely the pairing that the Yoga Sutra recommends as the twofold means of expediting the cessation of the modifications of the mind, which are depicted in Nirodha. There's thus good reason to suppose that the method of soteriological practice enjoined in the Samkhya Karika and in the commentarial tradition arising from it is either identical to, or at any rate closely aligned with the methods of cultivating non-attachment to sensory objects and to their fundamental constituents, or gunas, that are adumbrated in Patanjala Yoga. Sankhya's purported rationalism relates to the systematic articulation of its philosophical system, but the definition and enumeration of ontological principles that constitute the philosophical system are not all that Samkhya's soteriological practice amounts to. And I've got some concluding remarks, but I'll finish there to leave time for discussion.
Okay, we have some time for questions, and I'm going to ask the first one. And I would like a little bit of feedback from the suggestion that I made at the conclusion of my paper, which again needs fuller development, that the practice within Samkhya actually lies within the cultivation of the bhavas, whether construed eightfold or 50-fold, and that the psychological spin of the text becomes evident when we look at the detail with which he analyzes the states of mind.
The cultivation of the bhavas.
Well, understanding them, cultivating ultimately dhyana, but
Yeah.
being able to recognize, identify, and then, I'll argue elsewhere, to gain a little bit of distance from all of the other contentments and the complacencies and obstructions. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's part of the vairagya process, is initially discerning the sort of differences between different mental states, and doing that in order to eventually disassociate oneself from mental states. So there's certainly a sense in which the, I'm going to use the term analysis here. So, you know, I think there's a, and I don't mean to imply that Samkhya's got no place for rational inquiry here. It certainly has. And I think there's both things going on. There's sort of meditative process going on, along with, not simultaneous with, but sort of alongside within the practice as a whole, a sort of intellectual, rational interrogation and analysis of what's been observed within the meditative state. And I think the meditative practice is largely designed to sort of reduce the complexity of experience down to a bare minimum, so that it's more observable. And then you can, and you can also train attention through the meditative practice in order to then, in other modes of life, to discern the different mental states that are going on, the different bhavas, we might say. And of course, cultivating the bhava of discriminative knowledge as the one to be developed, but eventually dissociating from all bhavas.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, other questions, Jen?
So, Mick, I'm wondering if it might be interesting to examine more so. Maybe you do this in your paper, but I think it would be consistent with your examination of Samkhya in your book here from a little while back, where you're using Kant and Husserl. And one of the things you don't do too much in your book is you don't draw out some of the tensions between Kant and Husserl. I wonder if this would be interesting. And what I'm thinking of is different models of philosophy that are in some ways, again, in tension with each other in the history of Western philosophy. Specifically, the notion of philosophy as rational, and the notion of philosophy as a practice. And I may be blurring some terms here, but and maybe oversimplifying it. But I'm thinking of rationalism as being concerned with knowledge as a goal that one strives for and then achieves once and for all. And again, maybe I'm oversimplifying. But the goal of rationalism, the goal of philosophy as a form of rationalism is knowledge as a goal. Now, phenomenology, one of the critiques of phenomenology toward the history of Western philosophy seems to be that philosophy is a practice that one has to perform. It's not a system that one sketches out, maps out, and then realizes and then abides by that, but rather it's a continual practice that one has to perform. In the case of Husserl, one has to continually perform these transcendental reductions to kind of empty out consciousness of these like these false prejudices that it has about the world. And if we take that model of philosophy, then knowledge isn't so much a goal that one arrives at, but rather it's a skill. Knowledge or knowing is knowing how. And that seems a much more useful way of understanding Samkhya as a form of philosophy. Is it's concerned with knowledge, it's concerned to cultivate jnana bhava, is not a concern to arrive at some sort of veridical knowledge, but rather to cultivate the ability to know how to reason, to know how to perform metaphysical analysis, and something has to be performed again and again. And then what that also involves is a focus away from knowledge as an object, but as an activity. One thing you don't take up too much, at least in this your major study, is concepts of karma and bhava. Chris alluded to this, brought this up just now. But I wonder if this could help kind of develop this idea of knowledge as a knowing how, as a skill, skillfully knowing that Samkhya is concerned with, instead of knowledge as something that one obtains and then holds on to.
Thank you. I'll try to be fairly concise, and we can follow it up later on. I think various thoughts occur to me. One is that I didn't really want to go into much detail about the contrast between Kant and Husserl in a book where I'm focusing on Samkhya and just drawing on those Western aspects of Western philosophy as a tool for trying to illuminate the Indian material. I think an important distinction here is I don't find any what I would call soteriological dimension in either Kant or Husserl. So the extent to which the analogy is going to be useful is limited. With regard to distinction between a sort of rationalistic approach to philosophy and a practical one, I think there's a sense in which they're both there in Samkhya, because I think one can hardly deny that Samkhya is aiming for some ultimate end to the process, and that end is in part articulated in terms of knowledge. Now, it's not a sort of, perhaps a discursive form of knowledge that we might find in Western forms of philosophy. That's not the goal, but there is a knowledge goal and a sort of illumination. And so I don't think it would be right to describe Samkhya as in terms of purely a practice approach. So there's both. There's the practice that leads to an ultimate form of knowledge. And that, so if we wanted to draw some kind of contrast within the context of Western philosophy between knowledge as a goal and practice as a sort of ongoing process, I don't think we're going to be able to apply either of them, either side of that distinction to Samkhya wholesale. We're going to have to draw on aspects of each in order to try to explicate what's going on within that Samkhya approach. That would be my view. I think your more particular comments about your understanding of the difference between Husserl and Kant, I think it's probably not a good use of my time to comment on those now, but I think it's an interesting way to say. I think that's. Is that at least part way towards an answer?
Sure.
The fact that I think both the rationalistic and the practical aspects have a place within Samkhya, but understood quite differently from within a Western context.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, Jeff, in that you're affirming the role of rationality and the development of the skill of knowing. I think that's great, and it makes me a little less grumpy about Aristotelian descriptions of knowing. And then the second sort of place that I landed in doing a mashup a little bit with Jain material that uses very Samkhya language is that their pluralization of Prakritis, Artidus and Yoga and Illuminus, gave rise to my sort of emendation to the Samkhya tradition is that, like you're indicating, rather it being one singular moment, which would be a nice end-of-life moment or a nice complete breakthrough moment, but in terms of applications in life, that there are multiple moments of knowing, and that those are to be repeated as a practice. And Jainism helped me sort of arrive there. Okay, one more question. Okay, I'm going to take Lydia, and we're going to hold Morgan's question for a little bit later because we do need to watch our time. Okay.
I would have just liked to hear his concluding statements.
Okay.
Well,
I'm sorry.
okay. Well, it'll probably take a couple of minutes.
It's okay.
If I can find, oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, well, thanks for that request. Okay, so concluding remarks. We've moved in this paper from a consideration of the terms substance and essence as they've been applied in interpretations of Samkhya philosophy to considerations of Sankhya's soteriological methods. This move should be both unsurprising and hermeneutically helpful, since Samkhya portrays itself as a system of soteriological philosophy, whose analysis, obviously not in those terms, that's my gloss, whose analysis of experience issues from the need to address the afflictions and dissatisfactions of life. I've proposed that describing Purusha and Prakriti as substances, and hence thinking of Samkhya metaphysics as a form of substance dualism, need not be misleading, provided we're careful not to conflate Sankhya's ontology with others that have been termed substance dualism. Maybe it's a hard trick to perform. Notably, Descartes' dichotomy between extended substance and thinking substance. Prakriti isn't, or is certainly not exclusively extended substance, for the products of Prakriti include patently psychological capacities, or phenomenological aspects. Essence is not an inappropriate term for each of these capacities, for what Samkhya offers is an analysis of experience at a high level of abstraction. It gives us not descriptions of particular experiences, but rather a conceptual framework comprising the various types or features that experience can have. In other words, Samkhya philosophy distills experience down to its essential characteristics. From a soteriological perspective, it does so precisely so that, in the context of meditation, those characteristics may be objectified and dissociated from the meditator's true self, namely Purusha. Sankhya's definition of Purusha precludes its being a thinking substance, for thinking is an activity and Purusha is deemed to be in itself inactive. While maintaining that Purusha's presence makes thinking possible, Samkhya seeks to drive a conceptual wedge between the thinking itself and the awareness that, as it were, receives the thoughts. Thought and experience are portrayed figuratively as a dancer performing before the spectator's gaze. But as we've seen, the idea of Purusha as completely passive breaks down under the strain of the assumption that Purusha's liberation involves the dawning of discriminative knowledge. Affirming that I am not Prakriti can be done, as Descartes would have been apt to observe, only by a thinking thing, which is why some interpreters, against the grain of the text, have attempted to read Purusha's denial of his identity with Prakriti at Karakar 64 as, paradoxically, Buddhi's recognition of its own non-consciousness. But the idea of a non-conscious faculty coming to realise that it is indeed non-conscious is itself incoherent. So interpretive difficulties arise regardless of which direction we go in. Partly for these reasons, I propose that we keep in view Sankhya's soteriological purposes. These purposes can be obscured when a text such as the Sankhya is construed as advocating a rationalistic form of practice that consists entirely in discursive reasoning. Of course, the text itself is the product of discursive intellectual effort, and the commentarial tradition that follows from it would not rest satisfied with any admission of a deep tension or incoherence within the system. But we should remember that the Sankhya is also a poem. It inspires its readers or listeners not merely by means of cogent argumentation, but also through the deployment of evocative imagery. Beyond merely articulating a theory, it encapsulates a vision of life and experience that has resonated throughout Indian philosophical, religious, and artistic culture.
I'm very pleased to introduce Al Collins. And Al is, like himself, like Dr. Burley, Dr. Burley, we have Dr.